Life is a workout, and Smoothie King is here to help you power through. Whether you're crushing morning miles or sprinting through back-to-back meetings, give your body the energy, protein, and power it needs to help you conquer your goals. Only at Smoothie King.
And welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. Now we have some news. I'm going to post a link down below, but the Explaining History podcast has its own Substack where you can access, of course, all the podcast episodes. I've done one of those clever RSS things where all the podcasts go into one place, and I'm going to put all the blog articles there as well. So you should be able pretty soon to have all Explaining History content in one place. And I've put in, new things every day, little thoughts and observations, and kind of my general take on what's going on, which is kind of a very vague way of putting things, but there you go. You're probably aware, if you listen to this a lot, there are certain books I really, really like, certain things I like to talk about, and certain authors that I kind of hold in high esteem. And that, the reason for that, obviously, is because I'm one person, and there's a finite number of books in the world that I've been able to read, of which some are really good and some are really terrible. And fortunately, I never tell you about the really bad ones, because why would I do that? Anyway, on the subject of really good ones, there are two books. Hopefully there'll be more, because in terms of analysis, this is a writer I really, really value, and they're probably never going to listen to this, so I can speak my mind without being feeling sycophantic. But there's a British historian and author, James Barr, who I think if you want to have a really good understanding of the modern Middle East, he's a great guy to read. I put him up there with kind of Robert Fisk, who's the independent and the Times journalist in Lebanon for decades. A fantastic writer who, sadly, at this moment with the ongoing genocide in Gaza, the fact that we lost Robert Fisk is, and his analysis and force of thought is a great loss. So there are two books. The first book is A Line in the Sand, which charts the story of Britain and France's kind of equally reprehensible and kind of pointless behaviour towards one another in the mandates after 1919, Palestine, Mesopotamia, and Syria principally, and Jordan. And then the second book that James Barr has written on the Middle East. I think he did another one about Lawrence of Arabia, but the second book, kind of in the series almost, is Lords of the Desert, which is about Britain and America and their struggle in the 50s and 60s to control the Middle East. And that struggle, I mean, this is the great kind of introduction to all of this in the beginning of the book, is that the struggle begins during the Second World War. And of course, Britain's war in the Middle East, in North Africa, is a war ostensibly to prevent the Africa Corps from seizing the Suez Canal, but it was also a war to prevent the Africa Corps from punching through Sinai and into Arabia, where the real prize was, which was oil. The Nazi war machine, the Axis powers in general, by 1942-43 are approaching their own kind of energy crisis. There are the armies of the Axis, mainly Germany, are overstretched. Germany doesn't have oil; it's able to synthesize it, but the whole point of Barbarossa ultimately was to seize the Caucasus and to exploit that for oil. The German war machine relies on oil in from Romania, from Ploesti, but a far greater prize would have been the seizure of the Middle East. The British knew this, and the British had already begun to exploit Middle Eastern oil. And in the 1950s, they would do this far more kind of extensively through the kind of colonial extraction of petroleum from Iran and other and Arabia, under first the Anglo American oil company, and this was a kind of something deeply coveted by Britain's wartime allies, the United States of America. So, to begin with, James Barr writes, flanked by the Lord Mayor of London and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Winston Churchill stood up in the Mansion House on the 10th of November 1942 to deliver some good news. Britain had at last won a decisive victory in the Middle East. Rightly, the Prime Minister sensed that the war had reached a turning point, but he was determined that his words should not encourage complacency. Now this is not the end, he went on to warn, before turning to the phrase for which the speech is famous. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning. Whatever the moment represented, it had certainly been a long time coming. For 3 whole years, the news had invariably been bad. In our wars, the episodes are largely adverse, but the final results have hitherto been satisfactory, Churchill reflected, before reminding his audience, in the last war we were uphill almost to the end. Then he quoted the former Greek Prime Minister who'd once observed that Britain always won one battle, the last. It would seem to have begun rather earlier this time, he suggested to laughter. It was not the sound of hilarity, but relief. Largely adverse was a typically British understatement, when used to describe a war in which disaster had pursued disaster. After Norway and Dunkirk in 1940, Greece and Crete in 1941, there was no hiding the fact that 1942 had been calamitous so far. In February, the German pocket battleship Nassau and Scharnhorst had steamed through the Straits of Dover unopposed. A few days later, Singapore surrendered and the Japanese marched 85,000 British Empire troops into captivity. Many of them would not survive. Churchill also depicted the 33,000-strong garrison in the Libyan port of Tobruk as the linchpin of resistance to Hitler. But in June, while he was in Washington to confer with Franklin Roosevelt, it too had capitulated. He would not forget how the president had wordlessly passed him a pink slip of paper bearing the news before solicitously inquiring if there was anything he could do to help. Defeat is one thing, Churchill wrote in his memoirs. Disgrace is another. The beleaguered Prime Minister had returned to Washington from London to face down criticisms that his strategy was failing, as well as calls to resign his role as Minister of Defence, a tactic that he reckoned was the first step on the long road to forcing him out altogether. He was a man who wins debate after debate and loses battle after battle, claimed one sceptic during a parliamentary debate on his direction of the war. Although Churchill easily survived the vote of confidence that followed it and set off soon afterwards to see the situation in Egypt for himself, it was hard to deny that his critics had a point, not least when the Dieppe raid proved a fiasco that August. At the Mansion House, Churchill now finally had something he could brandish at his critics. Now we have a new experience. We have a victory, a remarkable and definite victory, he announced to cheers. At the end of October, a predominantly British force had attacked the Germans at El Alamein, and a few days later, one of the midterm elections had passed, and United States troops had landed at the other end of North Africa. The German army, now in headlong retreat to avoid being pinched between the Americans and the British, had been very largely destroyed as a fighting force, the Prime Minister declared. If, in the first half of his speech, Churchill sounded cautiously optimistic, in the second half of the speech he bristled with defiance, because he knew what would come next. Having been a minister during the previous war, he knew from personal experience that the prospect of the end of the current one, no matter how long the final victory might be in coming, would again trigger a debate between Britain and the United States about the shape of the peace. The signs were that history was repeating itself. From the safety of the other side of the Atlantic, Roosevelt was already arguing that there was no room for empire in the post-war world, just as his predecessor Woodrow Wilson had done during and after the last war, resisted by the British all the way. When, at the armistice of 1918, Churchill's private secretary declared that he was so grateful for the American contribution to the victory, he wanted to kiss Uncle Sam on both cheeks, Churchill had retorted, but not on all four. By November 1942, Churchill must have feared that, if Uncle Sam was to present the other two cheeks to him, it might be difficult to say no. Over a year earlier, after Britain allied herself to Stalin following Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, he'd received a summons to a meeting off Newfoundland from Roosevelt. He crossed the ocean, half hoping that the president might declare war then and there. He was to be disappointed, for over dinner on the 9th of August 1941, Roosevelt, who was wondering what secret deal the British might have stitched up with the Russians, instead asked him to commit to a joint declaration respecting the principles of self-determination and free trade for all peoples. Churchill knew that both concepts had ominous implications for Britain and her empire, but he did not dare annoy the man on whom his hopes of victory depended. He and his advisers hurriedly drafted a declaration, which Roosevelt then signed, rewrote, but Churchill managed to dilute it somewhat by deleting the president's reference to trade discrimination, an attack on the tariff system imposed across the British Empire known as imperial preference, that left American companies trying to sell goods into an enormous market at a significant disadvantage. But he had no choice but to agree to what would become no later as the Atlantic Charter, and it was clear that the issues that it broached were not going to go away, particularly once the United States started footing the bill for Britain's war effort, and then, after Pearl Harbor, during the battle itself. So, I have often believed that a great and overlooked moment in the history of the 20th century is the meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt at Placentia Bay. The reason I believe it's so important is because it is the moment at which America sets out its stall. It sets out what it wants from the Second World War. And what it wants is a defeat of fascism, yes. But it also wants to see the end of British and French imperialism. The Wilson and Roosevelt both believed that the time of European empires was up, and they believed it for a number of reasons. Firstly, they found European empires objectionable and distasteful and dislikable. But this is a country that has its own empire. This is a country that has a de facto colony in the guise of the Philippines. This is a country that exercises the Monroe Doctrine over Central and South America. This is a country that has a far more brutal and violent colour bar than the British and the French have. This is a country that is not a kind of a paragon of um, of liberty and anti-imperialism. Far from it. This is a country of merchants and businessmen and people and you know elites of kind of American capital saw, as Roosevelt did, golden opportunities in a post-war world where European empires are gone. And conditional, and Churchill was no fool. He could see this coming, and he knew that America, if it was able to guarantee some kind of commitment to global free trade, would dismantle economically the British Empire. Once you tear down tariff barriers to Studebaker cars and to American manufacturing in India and Africa and Canada and Australia, then the British lose those markets. They won't be able to compete in them, or they won't be able to compete in them half as well, and the British economy will crater. James Barr continues. Knowing that he could not win the war single-handedly, Churchill had tried from the outset to drag the Americans in. Now that he'd managed to do so, he was having to confront the consequences of that strategy's success. It was only at the Mansion House after victory at El Alamein that he had felt strong enough to mount a sturdy public defense of the empire against the incoming American assault. Although he readily acknowledged that it was American weapons and equipment that had finally enabled the fight with the Germans at El Alamein on equal terms, there was some extraordinary statistic about how tankers, Liberty ships full of Sherman tanks, getting sunk in the Atlantic, and before the time when they were supposed to have arrived in Egypt, another shipload of tanks having sort of set sail. The extent to which the British were resupplied in the desert with American aircraft, American artillery, American jeeps and trucks, and American tanks is again is something in the British national story we don't kind of look at in great depth, but it's definitely true. Churchill emphasised that the battle had been fought throughout almost entirely by men of British blood. For a year, the British Empire had provided the only resistance to Hitler, he argued, and he had no plans to acquiesce or to break it up now. Britain was not fighting for profit or expansion, he insisted, rebutting an accusation that was regularly made, not just by the enemy, but the time had come to make something else very clear. We mean to hold our own, he stated to Cheers. I have not become the King's First Minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. I am proud to be a member of that vast commonwealth and society of nations and communities gathered in and around the ancient British monarchy, without which the good cause might well have perished from the earth. Here we are, and here we stand, a veritable rock of salvation in this drifting world. It's often assumed that these pointed remarks were aimed at Roosevelt, but in fact, Churchill had another American in mind. So, the other American that Churchill has in mind was the contender for the 1940 presidential election, Wendell Willkie. Wendell Willkie had become the president's special envoy in the Middle East, and he was not an Anglophile. There were numerous American diplomats and servicemen, and high-ranking as well during the war. Admiral King, General Joe Stilwell, who really didn't like the British. And part of the reason for that is that they tended to come up against they mistrusted British designs. They suspected that the British were sly and self-interested and looking to line their own pockets and expand their own influence. And it's like, well, yeah, sure, of course. And so it was every power, every Allied power. The French and the Americans certainly were no different. They also often disliked kind of British manners and the kind of the elitism of Britain's kind of elite officer class, finding it kind of condescending, which it is. So James Barr writes, 9 weeks earlier, when the victory proclaimed by Churchill was a distant and uncertain prospect, a 4-engined American bomber had landed at Cairo airport with an important passenger aboard. Once it had taxied to a halt, its padded side door swung open to reveal a large, familiar-looking man dressed in a rumpled suit and a pith helmet, who had then half raised an arm to acknowledge the small crowd that had turned out to greet him. Wall-to-wall press coverage of the US presidential election 2 years earlier made Wendell Willkie instantly recognizable. He was the Republican candidate, the dark horse from Elwood, Indiana, who, with a booming voice and seismic handshake, who had challenged Roosevelt for the presidency but lost. Now made a special envoy by the very man who defeated him, he'd come to Egypt on a 31,000-mile odyssey around the world. This journey was to be a formative experience for Willkie, and that had dramatic implications for Britain. For when the American politician set out from the East Coast to the end of August, at the end of August 1942, he was one of the most energetic American supporters of Britain. By the time he'd reached the West Coast, 49 days later, he'd turned into one of her most outspoken critics. With hindsight, it is clear that Willkie helped to trigger the beginning of the end of Britain's empire in the Middle East. After posing for press photographs beside his aircraft, Willkie left the American embassy, where the ambassador briefed him on the fragile situation. 10 weeks had passed since the German General Erwin Rommel captured Tobruk and chased the British back to their prepared defences at El Alamein, just 75 miles west of Alexandria. Until that point, Cairo had escaped the rigours of the conflict. The atmosphere of easygoing calm was shattered on the 1st of July, on what was soon dubbed Ash Wednesday. The British Embassy and military headquarters incompetently burned their files, scattering charred fragments of secret information and seeding panic across the city. It was soon after this that Churchill had appeared in Cairo. Having survived the vote of confidence in Parliament, he then flew to Egypt so that he could visit the front, fire the general in command, and insist that his order to fight to the last man must, if necessary, be carried out. All the same, the American ambassador was not hopeful about the future, Willkie recollected. He blamed British bungling. The precarious military situation was made worse by the fact that the relations between the British and the Egyptians were awful. The British had invaded Egypt in 1882 in order to take over the Suez Canal and safeguard the route to India, and they had never left. "We do not govern Egypt," Britain's first consul general at in the country would claim. "We only govern the governors of Egypt."
With McValue at McDonald's, you don't just get deals on the drinks. You get deals on McDonald's drinks. So when you're breaking a sweat, embrace the chill without breaking the bank. And when your crew is running on empty, keep your wallet full while refreshing the squad.
Grab a cold drink at a hot price, like a refreshing Coke Zero or sweet tea in any size for only $1.49. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
It was subtly lost on the general population. The British let Egypt remain part of the Ottoman Empire, run by a Khedive who paid homage to the Ottoman Sultan, an arrangement that lasted until the Ottomans declared war on Britain in November 1914. At that point, the British dismissed the Khedive and declared his uncle Sultan and made Egypt a protectorate. That lasted until 1922, when the Sultan declared himself king and the country independent. Egyptian independence had come at a cost that made it meaningless, however. To gain their freedom, the Egyptians were obliged to acquiesce to a treaty that granted Britain the right to station 10,000 troops along the Suez Canal and made her responsible for defending the country in the event of an attack, an arrangement that sowed the seeds for the 1956 Suez Crisis, about which more later. The outbreak of war in 1939 brought hundreds of thousands of British imperial troops back to Egypt, and with them, roaring inflation and food shortages. The invasiveness of the measures required to defend the country would cause endless friction between the Egyptians and the British, and the man at the centre of all this trouble, whom Wilkie met after his briefing from the United States ambassador, was the current British ambassador to Egypt, Sir Miles Lampson, a 6-foot, 5-inch bully who believed Egypt should simply be sucked into the British Empire. He operated out of an office at 10 Sharia Tolambut in the city, which was known for short as Number 10. Wilkie soon realised why. Although nominally the most senior diplomat in Egypt, Lampson was for all practical purposes its actual ruler. So, before we look at such luminaries as King Farouk and the rivalry between the British and the Americans in Egypt, if we stop to kind of look at the nature of colonialism, that the British acted as the rulers of Egypt, and the Americans as the suppliers of military hardware and soon manpower on the other side of North Africa. The wishes and the desires of ordinary Egyptian people are ignored until they can't be ignored in 1956, when they explode in anger, and we see the kind of the events of the Suez Crisis. But the British colonial mindset and the American imperial mindset really was that these countries are places that they have some strategic value, and they are places where you fight battles to shut out a third imperial power, Nazi Germany. And if one is to kind of even imagine this from an Arab mindset, it makes and the encumbrance of having Europeans on your territory in general, it makes the upsurge in post-war Arab nationalism make a lot of sense. Obviously, the development of the State of Israel is a key part of missing part of the context there. But I want to talk some more about this book, so I'm going to probably do some more about that next week. As I mentioned, I'm going to be away for a little bit, so there'll be generally kind of a little summer pause that I normally do. But I can only recommend this book. I'll put a link to it in the chat below. And I recommend getting a copy, and getting a copy of A Line in the Sand as well. Anyway, I'll leave you there. Thanks very much. I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. All the best. Bye-bye.